Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Alan. It's Return to Healing on Sunday morning. And today we're going to talk about just a ruckus, I guess not a riot, a ruckus that occurred at the American Diabetes Association conference, which the American Diabetes Association is a group that people rely on, especially patients, but also policymakers, to create guidelines and advice for diabetes. They also are heavily financially funded by the pharmaceutical industry and tend to want more and more and more treatment, lower, lower, lower numbers. But at their annual conference, Alan, I guess there was a wild scene.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the intro, Andy. And for all you Nick fans out there,
Yeah, right,
the drought is
right.
over. So
That
I
was
hope
they
you
always kept coming back. It's pretty
uh,
amazing.
they made it there. So yeah, so this is getting a lot of press right now regarding, I guess, the overall arching theme is, and we'll probably get in trouble for me saying that, is the overall kind of censorship in healthcare from our current administration. So American Diabetes Association holds their annual research conference on an annual basis. This one was in New Orleans, I guess about 10 days ago. It's a huge conference. I actually looked it up. Obviously never went to one of those. I guess it's not obvious I never went, but we're poor family docs, so we don't go to conferences that are like $1,200 and
Oh my
last
God.
last a week. Like who has a week to go to a conference? Um, so I was looking it up. They literally have like 14,000 attendees. Um, and they have 1,500 plus booths. So for folks that's never been to a medical conference, the booths are where you go to get like little trinkets and crap, like a coffee mug or a pen, or you get to hear the spiel from the companies that are out there. And it's pure propaganda. And they charge for these booths like $15,000. Now, I was looking at the cost of registration for industry people, doctors, and all that, and literally they must make like $1 million on this conference. And getting to the importance of this, which Andy will tell later about what this organization does. It's they really kind of dictate the care of diabetes in this country, and we know that care is directed at drugs. And we know there's other ways of treating diabetes. So anyway, to get to the point, what happened? There was like four or five of these actually leaders of the American Diabetes Association who are editors of their journal called Diabetes Care. And these folks published a editorial right before the meeting aimed at the Trump administration. And I looked at the editorial. There was a couple of reasonable things in there, like, they're squashing vaccines and there's going to whole measles epidemic occurring in our country that's unnecessary. And it's all because the government is not funding healthcare. They're not funding research anymore. And everything was, just negative, negative, negative. And, you know, the leader of the NIH was supposed to speak. He backed out, obviously. I'm sure once they saw what was going on with this editorial and others, didn't want to get attacked at the meeting. So there was a lot of controversy. And essentially, what these guys did was they walked around, and there's videos on YouTube. If you want to go to YouTube videos saying doctors, ejected from ADA conference, and you'll find it. And the doctors were well mannered, like, just walking around handing out their editorial about, what's wrong with our government. Okay. We know there's a lot. So people from the organization who were running the conference came to them and said, this is against our policy of, soliciting and sending things out. They could have bought a booth if they wanted to get a booth and things like that. They didn't. And they kind of just used the conference for their own good. And they were asked to leave several times and they didn't. The security asked them to leave. They didn't. And then the police came and literally took these guys away. They didn't get arrested. They weren't violent, but they were ejected. And some of these people were speakers at the conference,
Oh
and
man.
their talks were canceled. Um, so anyway, in the article, the thing that kind of said, okay, I know who these people are saying, one of the things the government's saying it's ridiculous, like that, food and exercise has such a little part of what's wrong and what causes diabetes. And I was like, what? So they are essentially saying, the disease of diabetes, yes, it has some things to do with how much we eat and how many carbs we get and how much we exercise off. But it's a very complex disease that, really requires drugs, essentially. I think that's their view. And their view is drugs for everything. And me, when I treat a diabetic, if I get a new diabetic and they're type 2 and they're not ketotic, so for the audience, what that means is they have no risk of ending up in the hospital because their sugar's been 250 for years, probably, and nothing bad's going to happen if you put them on a good trial of lifestyle medicine, good diet, good exercise, and follow the trends in their sugar. That's how I do it. Like, I don't, my residents in the program, they have this protocol. If someone comes in, it's over 300, they automatically start metformin and insulin. And I just like cringe because we know insulin makes your sugar drop. You eat more, you get fatter. So that's kind of the crux of what happens. So what do you think, Andy? Did the ADA do the right thing?
Well, the ADA is going to censor its own people because their own people were basically saying what the ADA believes, which is kind of ironic. So I don't know. I think they could be upset that, of offending the administration, and so they'll get less funding. But look, let's face it, the ADA has been censoring for a long time. This was like an obvious example of ADA censorship, but you can't, you cannot go to an ADA conference probably and talk about lifestyle medicine. And all those booths you talk about are paid by industry. And industry is, and guess what? If someone is not going to have a booth that talks about diet or has books about diet and lifestyle changes, they don't get invited to the ADA conference. So the ADA is, so this is how I look at it, Alan. There is like this overt censorship of these people who clearly there was some political infighting within the ADA that caused this even to happen. Why these people decided to hand out the articles, they were probably told not to. It was probably a power struggle. So that made the news. The quiet censorship that's going on all the time with organizations like the ADA that are so dependent on the pharmaceutical companies and are driven by them, that is never talked about. That's there all the time. Look, it's censorship when you charge, what, $20,000 for a booth, and you don't allow anyone in who's not going to pay that kind of money. You're only going to allow people in who can pay lots of money. That's a weird form of censorship that exists all the time. It's very subtle, and they'll say, well, it's not censorship. Anyone could do that. But if you and I wanted to have a booth, Alan, to talk about lifestyle medicine, we couldn't get in there.
We'd have to take a loan.
We'd have to take out a loan. So it's just that that's what always strikes me, that this kind of thing was probably just a fight in people who are trying, up top of the organization. I don't like you. You stop that. It's one of those things. People who are powerful don't like other people who are powerful, and there was probably an infighting within the ADA. And let's face it, this administration, the current administration in Washington, is putting severe restrictions on NIH, National Institute of Health funding for research. Guess what? The last administration under Biden did the exact same thing. They put severe limitations of funding on research. And if you look further back to the Clinton administration, he actually is one of the primary people who moved funding from the NIH to the drug companies. So before that happened, the NIH was funding a lot more clinical research. Clinical research means a drug comes out and let's see if it works. We're going to do a study to see if this drug works. Or a lifestyle change comes out and we're going to compare it to a drug. Have you ever seen a study like that, Alan? No, it doesn't exist because the drug companies would never do that.
Because it
Clinton said, we're
doesn't
going to,
make money for the medical industrial complex
no. So
or the
Clinton
TV
basically,
ads
I mean, Clinton
or
basically
or
said,
Coca-Cola and McDonald's.
none of those, and they all work together. Clinton basically said, we're going to save a ton of money if industry does this, and we don't have to have the NIH do it. So you look at the NIH now. Since then, it's been 20, 30 years. They fund primarily what's called basic science research. They don't do clinical funding, and so when the doctor from Harvard wants to do a big study, he's got one choice. He's got to find out if Pfizer's willing to fund the study. And if Pfizer doesn't like this guy because this guy said, well, we diet works, he's going to fund the lady from Yale. So everyone has to talk in the language of the drug companies, and the ADA has been doing this forever. There's so many articles about the American Diabetes Association just bowing to the drug companies. So I don't know if this little fight was really anything more than a power struggle. I guarantee you the people who were kicked out of the same exact philosophy as the people who kicked them out. It was just more power than anything else. And unfortunately, it deflects from the real problem, which is the pharmaceutical funding of all studies and the fact that censorship abounds. If you talk about lifestyle, you're not getting funded. And that's censorship to me.
Yeah, so Andy, you're right. And I don't know if the people in this audience know how powerful this organization is. So this organization is mostly funded by pharma. You might see TV ads to donate to the American Diabetes Association, but I think they get their vast majority from drugs. I actually didn't look that one up, but we could probably find out where their funding is
It's in
from.
our book, by the
Yeah.
way. It's in our
Uh,
book, and it's
uh,
I don't know, it's like 70 or 80%.
Right.
It's a big
And they have
number.
something like 1,000 employees or something. It's a huge, huge organization. And they set the standards for diabetes care. They come out with the annual, 2026 American Diabetes Standards of Care. And yeah, they say, lower get on a diet and do some exercise. But the whole thing is overwhelmed by drugs, 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 drugs. And some of them do have some evidence. Many of them don't. In fact, many of them have been removed from the market over the years. Many of them, like continuing to use some of the other drugs that actually cause harm to the kidneys or can cause hypoglycemia and kill you. These people push insulin. Insulin remains a big money maker despite the caps that they're putting on. And, insulin is a dangerous drug, especially in the elderly. It really is. So it brings up the highlight of, where do these American diabetes standards come from every year? Quote, once again, expert opinion. It's not like there's a review that, and I'm not saying none of these people review the articles, but they review the articles, again, as we know, made by the pharmaceutical companies of studies that were funded by the pharmaceutical companies. And they're only going to talk about the ones that are going to sell a lot of their drugs. And they're not going to talk about what like a balance is in medicine. They're not going to talk about the fact that, metformin, which I think most will consider the standard drug that's been around a long time and it's safe and effective and most importantly, really cheap and only makes the generic manufacturers money. Your copay for a 3 month supply of that is, $20 if you go shopping around versus, Jardiance and Ozempic and Monjaro, Ozempic, it's like these companies are making billions of dollars and then they are in turn setting the standards of care saying their drugs need to be at the top of the list. It's that one huge problem. So the strengths of these organizations, of the medical industrial complex, and these healthcare societies are like the American Alzheimer's Association, which is pushing those drugs, and the American Heart Association, which is pushing statins and diabetes drugs now. My cardiologist, I know, he wants everybody on Jardiance now. So it's
Oh yeah, mine too. They
yeah.
just put them on. Yeah, for
So,
not
you
well
know,
studied.
the whole system is messed up because of the medical industrial complex of big pharma and device makers and these specialty societies and our own specialty. And the ADA is like a quasi, it's like kind of the society of diabetologists as well as the society of people. But that's the one issue. Censorship is the other issue. They didn't want the lead. They probably had an argument about talking about this. As you said, it was a power play. And probably, they were overrun or overvoted in the fact that they were just too worried about their funding if they did this. The other thing I had in mind when I was looking at it, because this conference never would have gotten any publicity at all if this didn't happen. Like, do you ever see the proceedings on, Channel 7 Eyewitness News kind of thing? It might eventually make it into something that if they discuss some landmark finding, which I didn't see anything landmark came out, you might see it in a newspaper or something, but this got a lot of press out there to the organization. And then the full circle is coming back. What happens to Andy and me when we talk about this stuff? And the state boards get us in trouble. And we know the same kind of people, I'm not saying the same person, the same kind of people are on the state boards that are doing the same thing.
Yeah, which is a censorship. I mean, I remember Alan. So in our book we talk about this, but there are 4 or 5 landmark studies on diabetic treatment. Huge studies. This is before the NIH was removed from funding studies, and these studies, all of them, clearly show aggressive treatment of diabetes is dangerous. In fact, we just wrote an article about it.
Hmm.
We'll attach it to the to our blog about this. But if you push the A1C below 7, your risk of stroke, death, falls, everything increases.
All
Everything
cause
increases.
mortality.
All-cause mortality. So we know that these are these landmark studies. They all show this, and yet the ADA, the American Diabetes Association's primary mantra is push A1C below 7. And so when I first started my new practice, I remember this group coming in to my office, and they said, we're a group. We're trying to show that this whole push by the drug companies and the American Diabetes Association to push A1C7 is dangerous, and you have a geriatric group. Could you put up our flyers? We have all the articles. And I did because I was pretty impressed that they did it. Guess what, Alan? They went out of business within a year. Now, I don't know whether, look, we belong to an organization called the Right Care Alliance that couldn't get funding. Because if you can't get funding from the drug companies, I belong to American Medical Directors Association, which is all about geriatric care. You go to their conference now, they actually stand up and say, "Don't forget to visit the drug booths." I
Hmm.
mean, so guess what? Their whole philosophy has changed about what we're supposed to do in geriatrics. So this is a problem. It is a form of censorship because, as you say, if you go against the guidelines, which are created by the American Diabetes Association and which are antithetical to science, because we know you shouldn't push A1C low, especially in older people. If you go against them, the board comes after you. It's like this, and you don't, this is the way medicine works. It is constant censorship. And so this little bit of censorship at the ADA is highlighted because there was a fight and there were police involved. But Alan and I deal with a different form every day, which is we're not allowed to use science and patient-centered care because if it goes against industry guidelines, we're in trouble.
Well, and let's bastardize the science even more. So their push now, which I'm reading more and more about, is we talked about prediabetes. Prediabetes is when your sugar is lower than what the standard is that they say is diabetic. And now they're pushing to treat that with pharmaceuticals, and it's just adding more. So we know the disease was really created with little science at all, but the science of putting someone on drugs for prediabetes purely does not exist. So I don't know what they're pushing, and that they're allowed to do because it involves pushing drugs more as opposed to saying lifestyle modification. And it's just how these people get away with it. And it just shows you that medicine is not run by good practicing physicians. Medicine is run by the medical industrial complex. And part of that are all of these scientific organizations. And the biggest part of it is the lobby groups, many of which are attorneys who help lobby for the laws that our country abides by, and many of whom are skewed in the favor of this kind of stuff. And our congressman, I don't see any national hope anytime soon of creating something like a true primary care based health system that is based on wellness, health, and prevention, like most of the rest of the world is, because our specialty societies are too powerful, and the cardiologists are making too much money, and the neurointerventionalists are making too much money, and the dermatologists and plastic surgeons and all these people, and so much money to treat cancer. Why should we ever try and prevent cancer? Because it's treating it is where the money is.
Yeah, if you prevented it, that would cost them a lot of money. I'm reading all sorts of People write about this all the time. I'm reading a book now. It's called, no, I'd have to find it. But just one, it's called The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And his whole, he's a doctor from Canada, actually. He believes that we are missing the underlying cause of disease. We're treating the
Totally.
manifestation of disease. And like book after book is written about that, but you're not allowed to say it as a doctor. It's really interesting. By the way, we have in our book, and you really should read our book because we document all of this. But the American Diabetes Association invented prediabetes, and there is a big article in Science magazine that talks about this. And there are a lot of doctors. Dr. Antonides from Stanford's a big one. He's a great guy. He talks about how studies are geared toward they're completely manipulated to get the result they want, and they will try and try and try and not publish the ones that don't work. But he's like, this is going to lead to drugs, and the people from the American Diabetes Association said, no, we're creating pre-diabetes so we could identify the people, so maybe they could change their lifestyle. But everyone knew this was about now creating a new category to scare people, because Alan and I wrote an article in the American Family Physician that showed people with prediabetes are no more likely to get diabetes than anyone else. It's not a risk factor for anything. And yet now they're treating it with drugs. And soon it's going to be Jardiance, which causes massive infections, especially in the elderly.
And
There
death. And
and
death
death
from these infections.
and they and
I
that's toxic, lethal. I mean, the
so
infectious disease doctors I know hate this drug because they say they've never seen so much urosepsis, which is a urinary tract infection that gets in the bloodstream, and insulin, which is absolutely not indicated. Any of my old people go to the hospital, they come back on insulin. And they say, well, that's the American Diabetes Association guidelines, and yeah, well, that's not geriatric medicine. See, I get in trouble when I don't follow guidelines that have nothing to do with my patients because no one studied older people when they're doing this. But we do know that prediabetes was invented, and we all knew. Even Antonides in this study, this article a long time ago, it said, "Look, guys, you're going to use this to push drugs. We know exactly why you're creating this label. You're scaring people." And I hear now in the news people talking about prediabetes like it's a fact. It's
oh
just amazing. You keep saying it, now people believe it.
and they're advertising in on TV. I saw an ad on TV from I forget who it was. I don't think it was the American Diabetes. It was like the Ad Council and something else. And like, the ticking time bomb within you, pre-diabetes. Make sure you go to your doctor, not get checked for diabetes. Go to your doctor and get checked for pre-diabetes because it's a ticking time bomb that's going to kill you. And this is what we're great at this country. If we said on TV, don't get checked for pre-diabetes because it doesn't change anything, they'd be going after our licenses again. Okay. But that's the fact. And you produce the paper, but they don't care because they are more powerful than us. We are the two schmucks.
And the two schmucks, my current issue with the Board of Medicine, which is not resolved, I don't know what's going to happen. I gave them all the studies to back up everything I said. And basically, what I heard was that doesn't matter. The studies don't matter. It's what the American Diabetes Association says. And here's a funny thing they say. So there are these things called observational studies, which we've talked about a little. It's the famous Subaru study. People who drive Subarus have fewer heart attacks than people who drive Ford F-150s, but obviously it's who these cars market to, not the cars that are causing this. But so these observational studies are junk, and we all know that they don't prove anything. But this is what they said to me, Alan. They said, well, if you get enough of them together, if you get 10 of these observational studies and create what's called a meta-analysis, now it means something. So you take 10 junk studies and add them up, and suddenly they think that's better than a randomized controlled trial. Randomized controlled trials, if you're going to do it right, can take years and years and years to do. Observational studies, you just go through data and look for correlations. You do it tomorrow, and then you get 10 of them together
No, and now the people that are adept at AI could do one of these studies overnight. They put
overnight.
what they want into the AI system and it chalks out the answer.
Exactly.
And
And you
then they
get
just write it.
if you find if you do 20 and 10 of them don't work, you dismiss those 10 and just put in the 10 that work. This is what they
Exactly.
do. And it's that's called science now. And it's just we're non-scientific because
And
we
it's
believe
again another example of censorship when you're publishing the articles that are in what you want to happen, and you're not publishing the ones that don't show what you want.
exactly. And that's what we're up against. It's really very difficult to practice good medicine, patient-centric scientific medicine, because then they say you're anti-science. It's almost like Orwellian, 1984 all over again. But and we'll keep pushing, Alan. I think it's
That's our
important to
job.
know that most Americans now are very skeptical of the healthcare system. And I
Oh
think
yeah.
they're smarter than the press, than Congress. They see they're not so, they have common sense. They say, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. Where I live, that's not the case. That's a very, it's a well-off liberal place, and they just believe anything the medical community says. But
Well, and again, in your case, Andy, it's another example of censorship where the powerful have the power over censorship because you got called out by these people and the board went after you. And when you fired back, like they weren't going back at that at that, those cardiologists. Why? Because it's their stepbrothers on these boards. It's like the same people are leading the same people and keep stepping on the two schmucks and others like us.
exactly. They just dismissed my complaint. My complaint was a fraud complaint of testing unnecessarily against American cardiology guidelines. They just dismissed it without looking at it. And that's right. They have power, and that's a form of censorship. And we're living in a very censored world where the consequences can be pretty bad for us if they decide to destroy us. And no one's going to help us. No
Yep.
lawyers, no, there's no law. We are just at the mercy of these boards, and the boards follow the dictates of the pharmaceutical company organizations like the American Diabetes Association that don't use science. They have dismissed science a long time ago and have this false face. So yeah, all you look at the protocols, they're all observational studies that they use in there. They dismiss the big randomized trials, which is shocking to me, but that's where we are. So the good thing is in our microenvironment, when we take care of our own patients, I have found my patients to be very receptive to listening to actual facts and to a discussion and to the fact there's controversy and it's you don't just follow the American diet. And these are people who
Absolutely.
wouldn't necessarily do that normally,
And
but they
and
do.
and that's the buzzword in medicine. We call it shared decision making. And it's your information, it's the patient. You have a discussion what's based on that individual, and that's what's important for the patient. That's what matters to the patient, and that's the right thing to do for your patient, not just throw more drugs at them.
Yeah, and not use protocols that are, you say, well, this is what you have to do because it's in the protocol. When we actually discuss with patients, you and I would think a lot of primary care doctors are much more nuanced in our discussion and ultimately leave the decision to the patient
Absolutely.
after digesting it, but that's not what they want. And they're very opposed to that approach. They want a protocolized robotic. Soon there'll be a robot. In my book, it's Dr. Smith that I'm writing. I also, in
Okay.
my book, I have a condition called pre-constipation, which has become all the rage, but it's caused by amyloid. But anyway, anyway, that's how I get out my aggression, my anger at this. Okay, Alan.
All
So
right.
we're gonna talk. Alan was in Washington talking to a congressional caucus last weekend, but we're going to talk about that coming up, which is really exciting. And hopefully, someone in Congress will actually listen to some sense. But I have my
We're
doubts.
not hopeful.
We're not at all hopeful.
All right. Have a good week, everyone.
Take care.